we have a broad range of people who see books in their particular form. So as a literary agent, you are one of the first people to see books because you get sent them in their most raw state by writers. Publishers see those books too, but they also see them filtered by agents, and then they help get them to the greatest quality. We will hopefully hear about the role of the translator, which I was hearing about this morning from Daniel Hahn, who is a great translator, and how they are involved in spreading literature and ideas around the world, which is possibly one of the most important things that needs to be done at this time. And then lastly, Nicholas sees the books as they come out and has an incredible overview of the whole the whole literary scene, whereas I spend so much of my time reading what is being written. And so I'd like to start by considering the death of literature, because publishing has always been a very pessimistic industry. And when the printing press was invented, there was a Florentine bookseller who packed up and closed his shop in disgust at this new technology, and he never worked in books again. And every time there's any technological innovation, we seem to panic, and we seem to think that the invention of radio, or the invention of television, or the invention of the internet, or the e-book may end the book. But we're still here. We're at the Dhaka Lit Fest, and the book does seem to be going strong. But I'd like to kick off by asking Kartika about the particular aspects to publishing in India. My main experience is publishing in the UK, and how publishing is it healthier? What is the state of the industry in India at the moment?
You said you were pessimistic about publishing, and I happen to have spent the last 20 years in publishing in India at a time when it's all been optimism, really. Because 20 years ago, or roughly 20 years ago, is when Arundhati Roy won her Booker for God of Small Things, and it galvanized the literary fiction market. The readers, the writers, the entire industry seemed to gather around with a very new confidence in English writing, in fiction writing, in literary writing, and a confidence that what they were doing was for themselves as well as for the world. There was this initial interest in writing, which seemed to suggest that unless you were published internationally, you were just not good enough. And somewhere, I think something shifted at this point of time, and everyone, of course, there was the fallout that everyone wanted to write exactly like Miss Roy wrote, and everyone wanted to write that kind of novel. And there was a lot of sort of disgruntlement afterwards, was saying that, the West doesn't care about anything that's not the God of Small Things and exotic India and all of that stuff. But the fact remained that suddenly there was more energy, there was fresh interest in writing in English, and I'm talking primarily about the English language market. And after that, everything became defined by advances, by criticism, by all the things that was said around the books for the next 10 years or 15 years. That's how it was. And it seemed to be growing and growing and growing. My second problematic point of sort of shift here is when the book scan comes into India, when bestseller lists become important, when Amazon starts to tell us what to read and not read. And I think then something shifted fundamentally, which is that it wasn't what you said about a book that allowed us to think what more to commission, because that would have been the natural sort of cycle here. It became not so much what the critics said or the readers said, but what that goddamn bestseller list said. And that just transformed the state of literary fiction in terms of, at least in terms of selling and buying and publishing, if not in the writing of it. And I can't anymore say that we're as optimistic about literary fiction as we might have been, but I certainly don't think it's dead. I think we've got a long way to go for very good reasons.
Good. Arunava, is this something you agree with in your role as a translator? Are you flooded with offers to translate,
brilliant works, or are you as optimistic?
No, I think
my feeling is that the curve has peaked where demand for translations is concerned from publishers. It kept growing over the past few years, but now I suspect it'll plateau out or there will be a decline. And that's because, and Kartika, mind you, is perhaps, not perhaps, she is the finest editor of literary fiction and non-fiction in India. There's no question about it. And it's not I who's saying so. It's, if you look at all the literary awards, every award list has been dominated by books from HarperCollins over the past 4 or 5 years. So the jury has spoken there. But the fact remains that despite that, publishing and good and literary books perhaps should not be conflated anymore. Not in India anyway. Publishing is a business striving for sales, revenues, and profits just like any other business. And like any other business, it's the mass market and, I hate to use the word, but products that work in the mass market where the companies are devoting their attention. So I am not very optimistic about big publishers producing great works of fiction and non-fiction, especially by writers other than those who've already made a name for themselves. So in the Indian context, you know, an Arundhati Roy, whose new book will be published by Penguin next year, or an Amitav Ghosh or a Jhumpa Lahiri, no question, publishers will vie to bid for them. But the next layer...
And the next layer down, are they being published? Are there good small independent companies who are picking them up? And
No, there aren't. No, there's not. Maybe one or two. And
Okay.
even they can't afford the kind of... And
Yeah.
you yourself as an agent, you know that small publishers can't afford the kind of advances that big writers or writers with some kind of reputation expect.
yes.
So I think we are going through a big change, and I can speak for the subcontinent. I don't know if this echoes trends in the West, but I think we are going through a big change where we will see literature being published perhaps by smaller presses, which will come up. And I fully expect Kartika to start one, actually, now that she's quit HarperCollins.
I mean, there are a lot of ways of determining the health of a publishing industry, but I think the first and primary one that I wanted to talk about is, and I'm going to start by asking Nicholas, is whether publishing is producing books that will be read in 10, 50, 100 years' time. I mean, Clive James once wrote a poem about the book of my enemy being remaindered and the satisfaction that he got from that, which is when your publisher optimistically prints too many copies of your book, and then you find that these books, you know, the bookshops send them back to the publishers, and they have to they either have to try and sell them through other means, or they pulp them, or in Britain we resurface our roads with them, which is you know, sad on the whole. So, Nicholas, would you say too many books? Well, would you firstly say that there are books that are being published that you think are important, that are going to be read in 10, 50, 100 years' time, or it's impossible to say?
I'm really sorry you asked me that question, because it's not something I actually consider when I pick up the book. I'm not sure that it's a good thing for a writer to say to him or herself, I want to write a book that's going to be read forever, because I don't think... I think everyone sends off their little book in the hope that it will be, you know, the only book that's read. I think it was Martin Amis who said that writers think of other writers. What are they doing? You know, the opposition is just stinking up the place. They want to be the only writer. I think that's actually an ungenerous view, and I think it reflects maybe a little bit more upon Martin Amis than it does on the general position of the author. However, that said, I would say his best fiction will actually qualify as that kind of, for that kind of thing. And but I don't choose the books on the basis of whether they will be being read in 50 years' time. It's not a question that has occurred to me. Now you've just made my life a hell of a lot more difficult, because now I'm going to keep thinking about this. Thanks. But it's always... I love going to antiquarian, second-hand bookshops, and you can... There are just, you know, every era produces stuff. 90% of stuff gets absolutely forgotten. And if it doesn't get pulped or turned into wallpaper or something like that, then we'll have a negligible life somewhere in a corner of a dusty second-hand bookshop. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Posterity's verdict, well, it's fairly robust, and it's not infallible, but it's the only working definition that we have, I suppose, as to literary worth. Whether people are still producing books like this, well, we can't tell yet. I have a hunch that they are still being produced, but it's, are the are films being produced now that are going to be watched in 50 years' time, the way we'll watch an old, a Hitchcock or a...
Well, I'm actually going to jump ahead, and since you brought up film, but there was the big threat to the novel, surely, as a storytelling form, is television, and not in the form of just the invention of television, but the recent move by companies like HBO and Netflix to actually investing enormously. I mean, I know some very good writers who won't write books because they don't get paid enough, and it's TV that invests in them. And you have things like The Sopranos or The Wire, which are obviously not that up to date, but there are many, many more like Narcos or.
But and also it's the time that it takes to watch a damn box set. I mean,
Do you not have that time? Are you too busy at festivals?
I'm too busy reading books and then goofing off. But something's got to go. If you've got a job and you're working every day, and then you've only got a couple of hours of free time a night between putting the kids to bed and going to bed yourself, a lot of people will watch the box set, and that's the way it's going.
So I wanted to ask Kartika about so going back to this idea of quality, which it strikes me very much that you are the the focus is on quality. It's on an editorial rather than marketing. I mean, in the UK, we've seen the most sort of hotly contested books by publishers are always books where there's a sort of marketing angle where the author's life is very similar to the book, and no one was holding Dickens to these standards, but that is the way the British industry has gone. In India, is this happening too, or are you more?
Yeah. I'm afraid so. I think it's become as important for the writer to be marketable, for them to be the kind who will go up and perform on the stage, who have a life that's interesting, who have a selfie possibilities and potential. All of that is deciding what you publish and how you publish. There's no getting away from it.
Okay, no. I mean, there are success stories which are not. I mean, there are these wonderful books that just emerge, which no one quite expected. There's a friend emailed me recently to tell me about the success of Max Porter's Grief is the Thing with Feathers, which is a novella and then the description, I still don't quite understand it, but it's a sort of part polyphonic fable, but it's a wonderful book, and it's sold incredibly well against a certain amount of expectations, and it is those stories that affirm one's faith, that there is, that the book industry is healthier than we would like to think. Are there any books that have given you that hope recently?
The difficulty is entirely different in the subcontinent. Certainly I can speak for India, where we are talking about writing and reading English in a very different way from, say, in the UK or the US. So while we have a certain number of people who are able to produce that sophisticated literature that we might call literary fiction, there are only so many who are in a position to consume that literature, and not just because they can't, because the language is not accessible to them, but also for other reasons, like, you have 2 hours a day or whatever. Those other factors being different. But who are these readers? Who are these writers? They're a very limited number. They're a small percentage of our population, really, that's producing this. And therefore, the charge of political elitism, the charge that these are written by a certain class of people to be consumed by a certain similar class of people. So it's like an echo chamber. You're talking, writing, to each other. And that eventually led to a breakaway sort of movement almost, where a writer wrote something that just went into 5 times the number of I'm talking about Chetan Bhagat. Yeah, 50 times more than the highest selling literary novel. And suddenly the entire country was talking about how Indian writing is for Indians. The readers are here. Forget about looking outward. Let's look at what's happening here. And that's the other great difference that's happened over the last few years, which is the numbers are more for writing that kind of novel, which is popular commercial fiction in a sense, which is being sold to lakhs of readers in India. I mean, that wasn't even a thought for us that we could sell. We're selling 3,000 to 5,000 to 10,000 copies of a literary novel. If we're lucky, we sell 10,000. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of copies of these books going out.
Yeah.
So it's all about the language. It's about where you're writing from, who you're writing from, and there is no hegemony possible really with the English language in the subcontinent. So we can't even talk on the same terms as when you say a novel can be a sleeper hit because it's just a brilliant novel. It may be brilliant, it may be a sleeper hit, but our sleeper hit would probably be 5,000 copies.
Yeah.
So that's the big difference.
Okay. And the commercial successes you were talking about are all homegrown, or have you been
Homegrown,
haunted by the spectre of E.L. James?
So, no, homegrown completely. It's about, first it was, I think, campus literature. It was about college student kind of, campus experience, romance, etc. One part of it is mythology. One of the biggest selling writer in India in that space recreates mythology, Hindu mythology. And he's found many hundreds of thousands of readers. And the third other kind, which has more than one person in that segment, is the romance, is the Mills and Boon reinvented for our time, but written by young boys who, I kid you not, will walk into a room like this, get on stage, and the girls will all be like, ooh, and screaming and woo. And I mean, they're fainting all over the place. It's bizarre, it really is.
I'm sorry to let you all down.
But these 20-something boys have just taken over the market. And they're all over the place. They are like this new symbol of, what is the word? I want sentimental manhood. They cry because their girlfriends hurt them. They cry when their girlfriends die. And then they write another book about the next woman they met and married.
Apparently the genre is called misery fiction.
Right. And the boys are particularly good at this. There's only one or two girls in there. And they don't sell as well as the boys. The boys are the biggest sellers. So we're still trying to, between all of us, trying to figure out what this phenomenon is all about. What are we missing here? That, and we have to catch that trend if we have to sell those numbers.
Well, one of the things, of course, is that in India, unlike
that we're talking about, it's probably the first novel they've ever read. You see? And so while we are hoping that this will then be the great first rung and they're going to climb this ladder and read the brilliant works of literature around the world, they're actually just looking for the next of the same kind and the same kind. So we're not looking at expanding too much. We're looking at more people fitting their work into this kind of segment.
But you know what is, I'm sorry to break in, but you know
No,
what
go
is,
for it.
for the lack of a better word, what is scary for a Kartika or me is that, you were talking about whether these books will be read 50 years from now.
I think it sounds like they will.
But the thing is that these books, their first books,
Yeah.
which were published, say, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, are still on top of those bestseller lists.
Yeah.
So they're being read at least 7 years later.
And they're also introducing people to reading, and because in Britain and America we have a whole generation, because publishing is somewhere between a science and an art, and there's definitely people who think it's a science, and they tend to work in marketing. And you could see this whole generation of people who were introduced to The Joy of Books by J.K. Rowling, and you can now see what they're reading now, and it is Gone Girl, or it is Girl on the Train, and so publishers are, they're sort of surfers, lying there waiting, just thinking scientifically they're going to catch the next wave.
Going by what we publish now, Girl on a Train is the highest form of literary fiction compared to what we get.
Well, I've got something to go back to the UK and look into, and maybe I'll be, trying to sign these books up and sell them to British publishers. I was going to ask whether you feel that too many titles are published. I mean, I was just looking up some statistics a bit earlier, and in 2004, 125,000 books were published in the UK. And in 2014, that was 200,000 books, just individual titles rather than copies. And, publishers spend their entire time saying we need to publish fewer things, we need to publish fewer things, but then there's the tension of, when they focus too much and you have a group of 10 people all trying to, decide what the next big thing is, and you end up being a bit like the Hollywood, and you end up with the literary equivalent of Iron Man 3. So I wondered how you felt about that in India, what your sort of focus was.
I think this comes back to the translation problem or issue, actually, which is that if we are to look at diversity in publishing in India and go beyond the English language publishing that we are primarily concerned with, then we need to do a lot more translation from the other languages and get them out and market them as aggressively as we market the English language writing, which is the thing that's not happening now, except for the odd book that gets attention or the odd writer. For the most part, translation is just not seen on par with English language writing. So we are trying to force diversity into the list almost as though it's something that we need to do, rather than because the market itself is asking for it. So you have to keep going against the grain when you do it. You don't have the tools to do the right thing by it in terms of marketing it. And so we end up in this position where we have a very worthy mid-list, which does not seem to be taking off. And I use that word mid-list only in terms of numbers. What it is in terms of quality is right up there. It's a higher end of the market. But the way it's perceived by the market is as though it's that middle space which nobody really wants.
In the UK, we don't have so much of a mid-list anymore, and an industry that is quite uniform in its way of thinking, is mostly quite left-wing, has created a world full of literary oligarchs, and then...
Isn't the mid-list where the most interesting things happen?
It is, but it's sort of sinking lower and lower, and the rich authors... Well, the internet, social media has had this sort of polarizing effect that the big books are much, much bigger, but they're the ones that everyone, Girl on the Train, or they're the ones that everyone are talking about. And I might ask Nicholas now of how he feels that something like that threatens. What is the role of the critic now? Is it as important as it was? I read a piece by DJ Taylor, which I mentioned to you, about how critics are too nice now. Do you need to be nastier, perhaps?
Well, the particular nature of my job is that I recommend a book every week. So I don't, that 90% of the time, I do write for other outlets, magazines as well. But I do not waste my time with books that I don't like. If I don't like a book, I just toss it to one side and I wait until I find a book that I do like. So sometimes I think, God, wouldn't it be nice to be really savage about something? But that's not the nature of my job. I'm like a DJ who only plays music that I like. Luckily, for me, I have eclectic tastes. So, the best line about literary criticism that I ever heard was actually from, of all people, William Burroughs, who said, ask yourself, what is this book trying to do? And does it succeed in doing it? And that allows an enormously wide range of books, well, as far as I'm concerned. However, if the answer to the first question, as in what is this book trying to do, and it's trying to impress you in a meretricious way, then those are grounds for not liking it. And I think one of the problems that we see is, well, you're talking about big books. I'm going to take that very literally. I mean, actually big, fat, long books, which announce their importance to the reader simply by virtue of their length, and which can intimidate. And it's as if through sheer gravitational mass, that they stop people from actually saying, no, wait a bit, this isn't worth your time. I would prefer something a bit shorter and more focused. And this is also slightly linked to the number of books that you say are being published. The analogy, I suppose, is like the death of a star, which, as it dies, it swells up to thousands of times its original size. And I think we might be watching an industry in its death throes just by virtue of just how many books are being thrown out into the world, and the sheer size of them. I might be wrong, but it can be taken as a worrying sign.
I mean, I've always been of the school of thought that the sort of old-fashioned way of publishing was that you just, threw things out there, and then you found out what worked, and the accountants would obviously come in and say, 10% of our books are making 90% of the money. Let's only publish those 10% of the books, and then the editor would gradually try and explain that it was impossible to know.
There is a fallacy built into that as well, because because then the same thing will apply, but you're now publishing only 10%. Sorry, you don't need me to tell you that.
No. So...
Can I ask Nicholas
yes.
a question?
Yes, of course.
What do you read for pleasure, which is not part of your job?
P.G. Wodehouse or detective stories.
I like that.
Agatha Christie, genre fiction. Because I spend my time, I really like looking for the avant-garde, and I read poetry, science, history, fiction, classic fiction, stuff that's been rediscovered. So when I'm ill, say, horribly depressed, it's back to Agatha Christie and P.G. Wodehouse.
Thank you.
All right.
I remember my first trip to India, and that's where I found, editions of P.G. Wodehouse that weren't published in England, and I came back, because they just weren't. He seemed to have a bigger readership here, really, and in Bangladesh and India and the subcontinent than. And it was wonderful. Now, he had a very long career, and he published over 100 books. And I wondered if another way of testing the health of the book is whether we give writers long enough to establish themselves, and whether we have a blockbuster culture and obviously I think a lot of it depends on people, but whether we give writers long enough to write the books they need to. And can I ask you your thoughts on that?
Are you talking about
Yes.
supporting the writer and what?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, someone like Hilary Mantel would never have
Yeah.
possibly not have written Wolf Hall these days. Maybe.
Yeah, possible. I mean, in India, we rue the fact that there's absolutely no funding, no fellowships, I mean, there is some for nonfiction, but some, very little for translation. But as a whole, I think there is no possibility of a writer trying to get financial support from anyone. But I do know that publishers traditionally have not been as hard on their writers as they are known to be in the West, maybe. As in, today, for instance, I had an email from my office asking, the Wiley agency wanted to know about the publication of a novel that one of our writers was supposed to have written. And the contract was signed in 2009. He's still not delivered the novel. And if it was the other way around, I think Wiley would have sort of made me return all the money. But being this way around, we're just going to have to wait and, wait forever maybe. But we will wait and publish because it's important. He's a good writer. And therefore, there's that kind of personal support that editors will still give a writer for a long, long time. I don't think that's going to change.
Yes. I mean, in Britain, there are publishers who are known for their devotion, and I remember once explaining to an author who was complaining that they weren't getting, the marketing support they'd wanted. But I said, well, if you were somewhere else, they might have just not published you, and they're giving you the opportunity, and they may not be investing in you as much as you'd like, but the alternatives are worse. Probably.
But haven't you noticed this pattern in writers? Their first book, they come to you and they'll say they're just so delighted to be published and that somebody's accepted their work. But the second book, it'll be, but you've done nothing, you've killed my book, you haven't marketed it. And by the third time, it is, why should I publish with you anyway? And then you have to remind them, that first time you came, you were so pleased to be published. But it's just like that, I suppose it's everywhere.
Nicholas, did you find this with your two books, the ecstasy and the agony?
It's been agony in both cases. I did have different publishers, so perhaps that doesn't quite the same thing doesn't quite apply. I managed to be equally dissatisfied with each publisher, although individually, I love the people I work with, and yeah, I'm grateful that they published the books in the first place. It's the publicity that I had a problem with, but well, let's not go into that. But on the whole, I love the people I work with. I love the publishers, and it's the black arts of publicity that is where they kind of.
But this is the conundrum as well. We were talking about this earlier, saying that, in any publishing house, especially perhaps in our kind of publishing house, about 20% of the books that you publish will bring in the revenue that's equivalent to what the 80% bring in. And therefore, increasingly, publishers, or rather, the management wants to put all the marketing money behind that 20%. They say, why? I mean, the fact that you're publishing the 80% should be good enough. And that 20%, if you backed it with all the marketing that you can, then you will end up making so much more and for a longer time. So why should you not do that?
Yeah, but I think the outcome of that is that how do you know which that 20% is? So the 20% is identified as the formulaic books,
Correct.
the ones that are coasting in the slipstream of a book that has been popular earlier. But the fact is that the original was popular because somebody took a bet on it,
Yeah.
not because it followed a formula. So, and what has really sort of killed, I think, the possibility of better and bigger books is this pernicious thing called the P&L, the profit and loss for each title. So a publishing house now has to produce a profit and loss projection for each title that it publishes. So obviously they're going to play it safe and not bet the farm on anything that could either sell 200,000 copies or completely go bust. So everything is, okay, this will sell 2,000 or 3,000 copies, so let's go with it. But the ambitions are limited, the revenue possibilities are limited. A publishing company has to meet its overall top-line budget, so it has to produce more and more books in order to get there. So if you could earlier produce 50 books a year, you now have to produce 150 books a year, which means the same number of editors and publishers and marketing people and publicists are now trying to push 150 books into the market. And there are fewer bookshops, chances of discovery are far lower. How people even going to know you have all these books, right? And the online bookstores are algorithmically driven to only surface what they know will sell well, which is the preset bestseller lists. And if you go to an Amazon in India, for example, it'll be a mixture of textbooks and paradoxically, I think the second or the third most bought and read book week after week is How to Read English. But no
Word
one's using
power
that to
made
read more
easy.
books. Yeah.
In English, is it?
In English,
Yes,
yeah. Yeah. So, it's like great books, but nobody even know they exist. And then the truth is that writers, there are a group of writers, maybe Kartika can't come out and say this, but I can, which is that there are a group of writers who are publishing only to be famous. They're not interested in either literary quality nor in being rich. They already have a lot of money. So what they're doing is they're going into bookstores and buying up display shelves. So when you walk into a bookstore, you suddenly find an author hogging the front rows, and you've never heard of that author, and their books are, floor to ceiling, and nobody else is visible. And so how is someone who wants to read good books ever going to discover the good books that they want to? And then they go, they pick it out, they say, what nonsense is this? And they walk out and they don't come back.
We don't quite have that problem in that there's.
Yeah, no, that's a real problem in India.
Jesus.
We have Charles Saatchi, who famously got his assistants to drive around London buying all the copies of his book they could in the bookshops that the Evening Standard monitored to try and get himself on their chart. And he got caught quite quickly doing that. It's pretty
So
obvious.
in India, people know this is going on, and there is absolutely no sense of, I don't know, what is the word I'm looking for? Like no sense of shock, no sense of, we should not even be talking to these writers, we should not be publishing them. None of that. It's like, oh, that's good business.
Yeah, it's legitimate
Because they're selling.
Yeah, and
selling.
yeah, publishers are happy.
Only to one person, but they're selling.
Yeah, exactly. and I learned about all kinds of ways in which you can game the bestseller lists on Amazon by periodically unpublishing and republishing or taking your book off the
Yeah, I've heard.
take it off the listings and then put it back in. So what happens is that when it goes back in, it becomes a new book. So it immediately goes, they have this list of new and notable. So every 4 weeks or so, your book is up there, new and notable. And you're building more sales that way. So Indians are famous for playing and gaming the system. Past masters at
and
it.
it's, in the middle of all this, if you're trying to sell a novel that does something completely different and that has no sort of aggressively marketable writer behind it, it's really difficult to get attention onto it. The only way forward is probably for it to win the Booker Prize or something, as happened with Arvind Adhikar,
Or do
which
something
then immediately, of course,
Or do
takes it.
something really immersive, like Rowling did with Harry Potter, which was so
Yeah,
big in
sure.
India, or with 50 Shades, which was picked up in huge numbers in India.
Yeah, but those books, they came from nowhere. They had
Yeah.
no big marketing budget behind
And they're
them.
over. I believe they're now being pulped because nobody
Are
wants
they?
to buy 50 Shades anymore. Their time has come and gone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, second-hand bookshops have said, please don't send us your
Yeah.
copies of 50 Shades of Grey. We have boxes and boxes and boxes of them.
Now, I wondered maybe if anyone had any questions that they would like to ask.
No.
The gentleman in the middle.
Do you need a mic?
Thank you. Straight there, just behind in front of the camera.
That was an unexpected death I
Oh.
didn't tell you about.
Thank you very much, the speakers, as well as the audiences. So my question is, what we got from you, that is, sometimes money matters for the authors, some authors, right? Sometimes money matters to the authors, right? Sometimes education matters to some authors. But my question is it the responsibility to those authors to let the people know that book is good, you read that book, but this book is commercial, so don't go there. I mean, significance of the good book is the author's responsibility to let the people know it, while money doesn't matter.
I don't think it's the author's responsibility to market their book.
Which one is the responsibility that you think?
It is definitely the publishers, I should think. It's the job, it's their role to market the book that they've decided to publish. But in this time and age, it seems as though the writer is an important way of marketing the book. And it's
How-
important for the writer to get out there.
Right. But how people will understand that that book is good?
It's just also,
It
there is
depends on
something
readers.
called the responsibility of the reader to go out and discover as well. It's not just the publishers and the authors.
That's the right point. But if you make the people's reading habit easy with some good books, then they will be encouraged themselves to habitual reading. Thank you very much.
I'm really sorry if you've already answered this. I missed the first
That's
few
okay.
minutes. I wanted to get a sense from you about are we being overly dramatic when we say that art, writing, reading is over? Or is that actually something you're projecting and seeing? Because from my own experience around me in communities, we're in an age where mediocrity is celebrated. So I feel if someone reads a little, they're like, oh, that person, greatest reader, reads so much. And that worries me a lot. So I just would like to hear from you, if you haven't already answered this, your thoughts on that.
So you're saying that the death of the literature has been overstated? Yes, I think completely. I mean, the fact is look at all the writers who've come out here to Dhaka for this festival, and look at all the people who are here, and I mean, publishing is never perfect, and there are always threats to it. We've touched on Amazon, who is the sort of gorilla in the room, but I don't think there's ever been a better time to be a writer. writers have all the choice in the world of how they want to sell their book to a reader. It's not easy. It's sometimes incredibly hard, but the people who are like agents and publishers who are seen as gatekeepers. I mean, now we're having to sort of help people, along the road rather than just say no, you can't come in. Some people you can come in, and there's so many success stories with. There's self-publishing. There are certainly in Britain and in America. There are a lot of small independent publishers. I mean, there were over 2,000 independent publishers registered for VAT last year in Britain, and I think 10 of them had more than 250 people working for them, and then about 1,700 had fewer than 4 people. And obviously, these companies don't necessarily hold on to their authors if they do well, because then the big companies come, but there's just so much variety. There are lots of problems. I mean, the main problem in UK publishing is one of diversity, in the sense that the majority of the industry is white and middle class, and publishes books for people like them. And we're only going to get smaller as an industry if we continue like that. But there are people who are doing things addressing that. And I think it's the most interesting time to be a writer imaginable.
Hello, wonderful panel. I'm interested in technology, really. What your thoughts of technology? You mentioned it. It seems to me to be the real crux of the question that's being posed in the panel. The rise of the e-book often gets laid out as a misnomer for the notion that there's some sort of technological shift in literature, when really it's just a digital book. It seems to me that all of media is being rocked by the fact that the internet allows people immediate access to language-based mediums, and a lot of the proliferation of recommendations has to do with the access of the internet and what it means. So really the question of something dying or not dying is perhaps not about literature itself, what makes literature up, but how people consume it and how people get their recommendations, and how, as you just said, the power system of recommending what's good and bad is dying. That's really what's dying, is editorial control. So I'm fascinated what you think about that, and the seismic shift that new media, which is only 20 years old, is having on the literary industry and literature itself.
Technology.
Occasionally a critic can have a little bit of a can help, but I mean there are loads of books pages still in the media. It's not just people seem miraculously I'm still in a job, and many other people like me, and they can make the difference. I think especially to a small publisher, they make the difference between making enough money to keep going for the next 6 months and having to fold up their tents and just go. So, in that, also, online bloggers are able to have an influence as well. I was once asked. I was busy losing heavily in a backgammon tournament, and the person was trying to psych me up. I say, what do you do? And I told him, and he said, what makes your opinion more worthwhile than mine? Which was a really bloody nasty question. And of course I came up with several hundred answers about a week later, but when it was too late. But the thing is, if you can transmit enthusiasm for something, then that can actually have it won't turn a book into a bestseller, maybe once in 1,000 years, but it can help, nudge things up from the bottom of the pile.
I think the technology part of it, in India, for instance, the e-book is a very small part of our selling. Overall, we must be selling about 5% or to maximum 7% of our titles sell as e-books. 95% or 95% of still physical books. And the good news for us is actually the bookstores seem to be coming back a bit, doing a little better over the last 6 months or 8 months than they were in the past, when everybody was so frightened of the e-takeover that I think they were going slow on the physical spaces. But we find that the E is not growing substantially at the moment. Connectivity in India is not so effective outside of the main spots. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just that the physical stores are so easily accessible. The books are cheap. There's no difference in pricing in India between the physical book and the e-book. So there's no great advantage to buying the e-book, as I think in the US and the UK, the price may be different, but here it's not.
No.
So if I can go to the store, pick up a beautiful hardback, bring it home and read it, and what I'll get for the same price is a download, maybe I just pick the hardback. And so we haven't seen, for various reasons, including these, we haven't seen the e-book being truly a challenge to the physical book yet.
And just to add one thing, Kaushika mentioned the idea of a beautiful book, and that's one thing that the internet is doing. I mean, if you think now that a book is essentially a file that gets sent from writer to reader, and historically the author has only ever got 10% of the value of the transaction, and that is going to change. I mean, it's going to take a while to change, but that is going to change. So authors should really make more money that way. And then if you've got the ebook, then there's going to be pressure on publishers, which they haven't, certainly in the UK, they haven't felt for far too long, to actually make the book a beautiful thing. And to act, I mean, I had lunch with a publisher in the UK recently who was telling me, not boastfully, but he was telling me that his huge company, not HarperCollins, had saved £10 million in the last year, through cutting costs of production, not on distribution, but just using cheaper paper, using cheaper quality things. And that's just like injecting water into chicken to sort of fool your customer. I mean, that is the most short-term and short-sighted policy. And if you want people to pay what you have to pay for a hardback in the UK, and so we're going to see less of that, I hope.
I also think that new policies that clearly are coming up on the net are going to mean that writers are going to end up earning less from ebooks. So I think this is going to be slightly murky territory we're going into, where the discounts will be squeezed very heavily so that the ebook gets even cheaper. Publishers will be giving higher discounts to the retailer. And at the end of the day, they will be giving the author royalties on high discount clauses, which means they're going to earn very, very little. That is going to be one factor in telling people, don't bother writing. I mean, just put up a Facebook post and get on with life, What is the point of this? So.
Yeah. You had a question there in the front, please.
Yeah. In sort of joining in with her, I was also very concerned about the death of the habit of reading, and looking at my shelf full of books, I saw my children, now grown, don't pick that up. And I used to be very depressed about it, but then I realized, I think you talked about it a bit, that they're probably doing their reading on other media. Anyhow, I won't take up time. So long as they're reading literature, in contact with some kind of their favorites will be different from mine. I do realize that. But my question is to the Indian writers here. Maybe, I think I heard you mention it. I love lowbrow literature, highbrow literature. Did you mention Amish and his trilogy? I would like to know, I'm sure it's very popular, judging by the statistics, how the literary world takes him. And thank you for giving the statistic on publication in UK. 200,000, that was very heartening. Thank you.
Wow.
So Amish, how the literary world takes him.
They're puzzled. They are envious. He sells a hell of a lot more than any other writer in India. And there's a what shall I say? There's a peculiar innocence to the way he talks about his own writing. There's a peculiar, I write as though somebody else directs my hand and I've got nothing to do with this. And it's become a bit of a mission for him, And he's gathering all these young people to the cause. And we would only hope that this would lead to more reading. But actually, it's just reading leading to them becoming more mythologized or Hinduized or something else that I don't think would be our ideal. So it's a bit complicated, that Amish question, if you ask me. No, that's fine. I mean, obviously there's hundreds of people, thousands of people who read him and love that work. But I do think we are not, it is political in a way that we're not talking about yet.
Sorry. I think the good thing that an Amish or a Chetan Bhagat is doing is that it's also telling publishers that people have not forgotten how to read. So if you can produce the right books, they will read them. The trouble is that readers, I'm not including you, but young readers of an Amish or a Chetan Bhagat don't go on to read other kinds of literature. They just wait for the same books to come over and over again.
But it's like the Harry Potter thing. Suddenly we realized that, oh, children can read.
Yes.
So when Amish and Chetan came along, we said, oh, adults in India can read.
They read.
So let's
Yeah.
quickly give them books that they will read. Except every publisher gave them the wrong books. Every time any of these people have made it, they've made it on their own. They've self-published,
Yeah.
or they've gone out there with
That's
a
what.
small press, and they've just made it with their own sort of marketing. And then the books get picked up by big publishing houses.
Yeah.
Every single one of us has consistently over the last 10 years got it wrong.
Yeah.
That is the truth.
Yeah.
of
And
it.
it's begun with a writer, not with a publisher.
Yeah, this is
It's
true.
a writer who's come up with something that people
So clearly,
love.
this perhaps leads to the diversity we're talking about. The kind of people who work in publishing, we're all the same kind of people. We come from the same spaces, we talk about the same things, we like the same films, we commission the same sort of books. And we just don't get what the reader really wants.
I think also what's important is that writing of all human artistic endeavours, short of singing, is the most democratic possible, I think, because all you really need is, at the beginning of it, is a pencil and a stack of paper. And that's about it. I don't think there's any other art form that can of which you can say that. Even if you're a songwriter, you'll need a piano or a musical instrument or something. But the entry level for writing is brilliantly low. And that's the kind of thing that will keep it going, because people will need to they will want to express themselves. And writing is probably again, short of standing on the street corner and yelling it out yourself, writing is as close as you can get to that, while also maintaining a potential of great cultural respectability.
The only things they do need the money to read the books before they write. And in the UK, our libraries are being
Well, yeah,
slashed.
okay.
But yes. No, I agree with Nicholas. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of it has been touched upon, but what I've been seeing throughout this entire discussion is this sort of comparison between quantity and quality in terms of a publisher's decision as to what they put in the market. But what I think when you talk about death of literature, or I think there is a death of quality literature, and where do you draw the line when you say at least they're reading something, even if it's Harry Potter or like Twilight or whatever, as opposed to not reading at all? And will we be defined as a generation that produced Harry Potter? The best thing we produced was
I
Harry
object.
Potter.
I love Harry Potter.
Yeah,
I'm
so do
just
I.
So delighted
but,
he's published.
So do I, but it's not just Harry Potter, but the whole idea of young people choosing to read things, say, that are considered perhaps escapist fantasy fiction and such genres. You said this is the best time to be a writer. There's so much content, and as from the previous panels today, we also got ideas about the New World Order, and there's so much social unrest, and there's so much content in general. But we see that the books selling most are the ones about sort of escaping to a different world. They're escapist by nature. So are we to be defined as a generation that produces literature that are more escapist rather than reflecting our own times and turmoil? I think that's my question.
I think you're definitely right. I think the sort of interest in books with zombies in, comes at a time where we're all terrified of conformity, and then with vampires is sort of slightly harder to explain. It certainly emerged in sort of Victorian times where people were, had very strong views on sexuality. But no, I think people are particularly looking for escapism at the moment. And yeah, I mean, there will be people who are thinking, what are people going to be reading now that Donald Trump is going to be the most powerful man in the world? And I cannot answer that. I'd love to think there was a book that could... Not his book, that's for certain. Now, we have a few more minutes left, so we've got time for a couple more questions. So one at the back there, please. Oh, okay, one at the front. Says
I want you to indulge me in a bit of speculative fiction, maybe. I'm thinking about the way in which the publishing model impacts upon what books look like. So if you think of a Dickensian model where it was originally published in sections in a journal, and that means that you result in these big, fat, episodic books. So can you sort of predict us for the future what might, assuming that the novel is not dead, but in fact very much alive, what might a novel in 100 years' time look like?
I think that no longer does... Yes, it is, and obviously Donald Trump would have nuked us back to the Stone Age, and we'll be writing on the walls of the cave again. Yeah. Cuneiform so. Well, I mean, the e-reader means that books don't need to be a certain length anymore, and obviously you've got things like City on Fire, and you've still got these great big, young men writing very, very long, self-important novels, which are going to be taken very, very seriously, which are I don't know. But you can write a 40,000-word book, and it isn't, it's that there aren't financial problems posed with producing a book out of it. So structurally, I think that there's more freedom there. But if anyone else has any views.
No, I was just thinking that in India, the thing that we spend the most time debating and discussing, even in literary translation spaces, is our epics from God knows how many thousands of years ago. And we still seem to find them fascinating and still seem to talk about them. So maybe there are some aspects of storytelling that are just permanent. They just shape-shift and become a novel today, a poem tomorrow, an epic eventually. But really, the essence of storytelling is not going to be any different if we are lucky.
So we'll have you go, and then we'll have that one last question back there.
No, I just wanted to point out that real life has sort of overtaken literature when it comes to producing drama and the unexpected and excitement. I mean, where do you can't get mesmerized by a book anymore when you see what's happening around you.
Breaking news.
And exactly, breaking news. And breaking news is not just who's become president of the United States, but what your best friend is eating for dinner. Equally important.
My question, it touches across some of the themes that were posed by similar questions before, but I wanted to ask about how technology, how the rise of the ebook and so on, like the internet, how it revolutionizes the publication of genre fiction, for example. Such as an example, let us say that I, as a Bangladeshi, wish to write a high fantasy novel, which is not a genre that is typically consumed much locally. It doesn't have a strong audience here or in the subcontinent, perhaps more in the UK or the USA. But I am writing locally. I am producing my content locally. Would you say that the rise of the internet provides me viable options for tapping into markets abroad as opposed to relying on local publishers here?
May I take this? There's a piece, something that I'd like to share with you. In India, we've just had the launch of a company named Juggernaut, and arguably one of the first of its kind in the world, which publishes primarily through a mobile app. You download the app to your phone, and then you read samples and you buy books and so on. There's a lot of genre fiction over there, a lot of speculative fiction, horror, romance, and prices are really low. They're selling their books at prices like 30 Indian rupees or 40 Indian rupees and so on. So while that is probably subsidized to some extent to try and get customers right now, it will, however, set a new price point, which they can't probably go back on. They can't now go back and say, okay, now actually it's $100. No. So it's already happened. Whether it's successful or not, we'll see.
I also think you will find readers anywhere in the world thanks to the internet, but how you're going to make money off it, that's not something you can easily do.
Well, I think that's that. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panelists.